Hi, I'm Lisa Fletcher, and you're in the stream. Today, what is behind the recent attacks in the Ivory Coast? And can the nation move beyond its divisions to avoid another civil war? Our digital producer, Malika Bilal, is here looking out for your live feedback. Tweet her using the hashtag AJStream. Malika, this is a complicated issue, one that our community is having trouble fitting questions into 140 characters. I know some of them even were resorting to sending us long emails on the topic today. And Francois Xavier was one of those. He's a regular contributor of ours on Twitter. He sent us this blog post, which is on my screen, The Rebels at Play in Côte d'Ivoire, and it's his ruminations on the topic. He shared it with us, and we're sharing it with you. So for those of you at home, if you'd like to join the conversation, tweet us, use the hashtag AJStream. Joining our conversation today in studio is Abdul Karim Bangura. He is a professor at Howard University in Washington, D.C., and he frequently speaks about the Ivory Coast and related African affairs. Karim, thanks for being here. We're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. Thank you.
We are also looking forward to hearing from you. Like the stream on Facebook. There's the page right there, also over here on my computer. You can tell us what topics you want us to discuss in a future episode, and then we just might do it. Go to facebook.com/AJStream.
Hi, I'm Alice Marwick. I'm an assistant professor at Fordham University, and I'm in the stream.
In the past 2 weeks, at least 6 attacks against Ivory Coast's military have been reported, and continued violence in the country's west is driving more Ivorians to flee into neighboring countries. The attacks come more than a year after post-election violence took place between supporters of current President Alassane Ouattara and ex-President Laurent Gbagbo. More than 3,000 were killed, and many believe the current instability is a result of resurfacing social and political tensions from that deadly period. So, can the Ivory Coast move beyond its deep political divisions and avoid further violence, or is this a nation ripe for civil war? Here to help us understand the situation better is Jean-Gervais Cheide. He's the treasurer of the Ivorian Popular Front. That is the political party of ex-President Laurent Gbagbo. He's joining us via Skype in Abidjan, Ivory Coast. And in Washington, D.C., we have Matt Wells. He is the Ivory Coast researcher for Human Rights Watch. He's been monitoring the humanitarian situation there. Matt and Jean-Gervais, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, Professor Bangura, I want to start with you. I think people are generally aware of the unrest in the Ivory Coast. They're generally aware of the civil war that took place in 2010 and 2011. But beyond that, I'm not sure that people have a good understanding of the root cause of the violence in the Ivory Coast. Can you kind of give us a framework for what's going on?
Right. Well, like everything, if there's not too much drama or too much excitement, we usually lose attention, we lose focus. Just interestingly, how many of us even follow the war in Afghanistan right now?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So in the Ivory Coast, one of the misnomer is that it is a religious division, it's ethnic division. I don't think it is. I think it's political, in that a particular group that was in power finds itself out of power, therefore no longer have access to the wealth, to the resources, and they felt left out and they want back in some other way. And if they can make the country ungovernable or make it very difficult for the current regime to govern, then they would create such instability that will lead to further chaos, further violence, that they think will plunge the country into another civil war, and then they might have a way to come back into power, which I think is not very smart, because the United Nations peacekeeping force is not going to allow that. And we also are worried because there is what we call donor fatigue. At what point does the international community just get tired of taking care of babysitting Ivory Coast? Mm-hmm. And the United Nations is already depleted in terms of peacekeeping forces and even financial and other resources to go to other troubled spots, the Congo, other places, the Middle East, and all of those things. So it puts Ivorians on the spot that they have to start talking with one another very seriously on how to go beyond this impasse, get beyond this stage, and try to mend their country. It's a country with tremendous resources, with tremendous potential. Until they can put aside these and listen to the people, this is what the leaders, Jean Jouvet included, are not doing. They have their own agenda. They have something to want to push. This is the same thing the Ouattara leadership is not doing. They have their own agenda. They're not listening to the people. The average Ivorian does not care so much about ethnicity and all that because they've intermarried. They go to each other's religious services. They live in the same communities. If left to the people themselves, we would not have all of this problem that is going on. So what is missing in Ivory Coast is leadership.
Jean Jouvet, I want you to respond to Professor Bangura. Are you looking out for your own interests and the interests of your party and ignoring the will of the people, not hearing what they're asking for?
Well, I thank you for the invitation. I was smiling when listening to my brother, Mr. Bangura. But the thing is that living here in Côte d'Ivoire, I know very well what has been going on for the past 10 years now. But let's just come to the crisis which happened in 2011. It is after the presidential election, okay? And this presidential election took place in a context whereby the rebellion, who was supposed to put down their arms, has not done so. First thing. Second thing, the first result, the first round of this election gave Mr. Gbagbo coming top with 38%, and Mr. Alassane Ouattara coming second, and the two went to the second round, okay? Now, after the second round, there is a result. Now, this result was given by the Constitutional Council, which is the only, according to our constitution, the only institution which has the ability to give the result of a presidential election. Now, there is a disagreement. Mr. Gbagbo says he has been declared the winner. Mr. Ouattara says he is the winner. Now, this is a contest. Now, when there is discussion like this, there is only one thing to be done. We go back to the ballot and we count down. This is the proposition of Mr. Gbagbo. Mr. Ouattara says no. The only way to clear out to sort out the problem is the war. Now, after this war, we have about 3,000 people killed. The question now is, who is responsible for the war? Mr. Gbagbo or Mr. Ouattara? That is one thing.
Well, I think some fairly neutral reports have decided that both parties are fairly responsible for the violence that's going on. But Matt Wells from Human Rights Watch, I want to bring you in here because Jean Jouvet mentioned that the rebellion didn't put down their arms. I think both of our guests agree that what's going on is politically driven. But I know that you have an opinion on the fact that the country is really flush with guns and how that is contributing to the problem. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, there really hasn't been disarmament. You know, it was supposed to take place in the aftermath of the 2002-2003 Civil War. It never happened really in the lead up to the 2010 election. You then had the post-election violence, as you said, both sides deeply implicated in grave crimes during that period. And then now, over the last year, we've again seen a real lack of progress and disarmament of groups, again, on both sides. Though there has been a positive development just in the last 24 hours. The government has finally created a body that will oversee the process of DDR. There have been, as recently as a couple of days ago, there have been 12 government agencies that had some role to play in DDR, which meant there was, a terrible lack of coordination, constantly sniping between groups as to who was responsible for what. President Ouattara signed a decree yesterday creating one group that will oversee the DDR process. Hopefully that will finally allow the country to take some steps forward in this regard, because absolutely, as long as small arms are as easily accessible as they are right now, security is an issue, and violence is likely to continue.
Well, you mentioned small arms, and that's something that our community members are also bringing up. Francois on Twitter says there can't be a legitimate government in Ivory Coast as long as an armed rebellion has control of more than half of the country. But Professor Bangura, there's a video comment here I'd like you to have a listen to.
Okay.
Considering members of both the FPI and LDR have been linked to the ethnic and political violence last year. How can you administer equitable justice in such a way where you're not undermining the current government and still preserving political stability?
That's a video comment from Milana, one of your former students. But as Lisa mentioned a little bit earlier,
Right.
things are happening on both sides. How can we administer equitable justice?
Well, I think this is where the Gbagbo supporters are correct. What we have with the hauling of President Gbagbo to the ICC is what I usually refer to as victor's justice. When you have atrocities committed by both sides, then I think a different mechanism has to be in place. I would have liked to see to be honest with you, I would prefer a TRC, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, just like we did in South Africa after hundreds of years when whites massacred and butchered and did all these things to blacks. And South Africa is better off that they went through the TRC
But isn't that
route.
the idea of this commission? Isn't that the model?
That is what would have to happen, but it's not going to happen now with Gbagbo in The Hague. And as long as he's in The Hague, his own supporters are going to feel slighted, his own supporters are going to feel like they have been railroaded, and they're going to find a way to make their voices heard, whether through violence or other means. And this is the saddest of the developments. But to Melina's question, how then do you get both parties to reconcile? Now it's going to be very difficult to do. And that means, except if both parties agree that Gbagbo is no longer part and parcel of the way to move Ivory Coast forward, then those who are now in Gbagbo's party and the current government have a way forward. But the thorn now is, how do you resolve Gbagbo's part of the whole scheme for you to get to that? That is going to be the most challenging thing ahead of the Ivorians.
Matt, talk a little bit, if you will, about some of these recent attacks against police that have been carried out. What are your concerns? I know that you have spent some time on the Liberia-Ivory Coast border. You have talked with fighters involved in cross-border violence there.
First, actually, if I could respond to what the professor just said, we agree on a lot of things, but I don't think we agree on this issue of the ICC. The problem isn't that the ICC that Gbagbo is now in The Hague to face justice. He should face justice for crimes that he's been credibly implicated in. The problem is that the other side is not facing justice for crimes they were implicated in. We, at present have over 150 people in detention from the Gbagbo side for crimes, and many of them should face justice for crimes, but no one from the pro-government forces at present has been arrested in a way that would lead to justice for their own crimes. And this, I think, is the core problem that the questioner was asking
Matt, why
about.
haven't those arrests been made?
If the country is going to reestablish the rule of law, that both sides face justice.
Matt, why do you suspect those arrests haven't been made on the other side?
Well, I mean, it's what we see right now is a judiciary that's not terribly independent from the political branches of the government. The government's in power, and it so far has not shown the will to go after its own forces that were implicated in atrocities. And I think this, has reinforced the perception that the government at present only represents, one side of Cote d'Ivoire. Of course, politics always come into play, but they shouldn't come into play when we're talking about victims' basic right to justice.
But Kareem, wouldn't that strategically be an excellent move for the government to do that? Wouldn't that establish credibility not only among its people, but globally?
This is the problem we have with Cote d'Ivoire being one of those very more complex than other situations. The next in line, or the next person in power to Ouattara is Guillaume Soro, who is really the leader of the Forces Nouvelles, the new forces that took over the country in 5 days. And these are the folks that will be the culpable on the other side. How do you deal with a Guillaume Soro, who also really served under Gbagbo also during the interim period to make sure the such different feelings and to bring things to bear. So then if you're going to arrest, he will have the greatest culpability in terms of his forces or whatever they did. How do you then now arrest the person that is the vice to the current prime minister to face that? This is, for me, I don't think it's ever going to happen. Except again with a lot of pressure from outsiders, which many of us don't want again, because we know when you have superpowers putting pressure on developing countries, the whole specter of why don't we have superpower presidents also in The Hague to face their own bid for certain wars, the illegal wars they have perpetrated in other nations, the whole shebang continues. So again, at some point, Ivorians, at the end of the day, we can have all this discussion, we can have all this superpower, we can have all these outside mechanisms in place, but Ivorians have to come to the realization that they are wasting time, they are wasting future generations by constantly fighting each other, by constantly finding reasons why they cannot move past this stage.
Well, Jean-Gervais, I want to get your comments on what the professor just said, but first I'd like to read you some of the divided opinion on Twitter. Vince Zinat says, it's really sad how the former leader, meaning Gbagbo, wanted to stay in power even when he wasn't elected. And of course, that not exactly correct. And he says, greed is the reason for Ivory Coast now. But on the other hand, you have a tweet from Zachary George who says, have civil liberties improved since Ouattara took office?
Well, I just come back to the analysis made by the former intervener. It is clear that the Ivorians have it is our responsibility today to go forward, to talk to each other, and to come to a certain common agreement. But the problem is that one side is in power. Mr. Ouattara is in power. And we are Mr. Gbagbo's side, we think that it is the duty of the person who is in power to gather the other part of the population. After election in Africa, the winner has the duty to call the opposition to say, come together, come and join me so that we can build the country. But this is not what Mr. Ouattara and his camp are doing. So we are in the opposition. We are the FP, we are in the opposition. We know what has happened since 2002 with Mr. Soro Guillaume coming at the head of a rebellion, 10 years of sharing power with Mr. Gbagbo, and now no disarmament and election. But all this is behind us. How do we build the future? And it is the first responsibility of the government to take the measures that will come together in a reconciliation to go forward. Somebody talked about South Africa. Now, South Africa, they are in Africa, but I think for the moment, they are more clever than what we are doing in Cote d'Ivoire. It is the responsibility of the government to call the other parties to a forum so that we can discuss. We are brothers and sisters in the country. It is possible to come to a certain agreement. It is possible.
Matt, I'd like to, I'm sorry to cut you off, Jean-Gervais, but you raised an interesting point that I want to bring Matt in here, because you talk about moving towards the future, and Matt, I'd like to know what that future is. There's a tweet from Widadi who says, my sources tell me Ivory Coast seems to be headed towards another civil war. What are we seeing on that border region of Liberia? What are we seeing that could make this true?
You know, I wouldn't overstate the threat in the short term. There have been a series of concerning attacks both in Abidjan and along the border region, but nothing to indicate that we're really swiftly heading towards a civil war. We were along the border of Liberia and Cote d'Ivoire in May, put out a release in early June, in which we had documented a string of attacks in which former Gbagbo militia and military were crossing from Liberia into Cote d'Ivoire, attacking villages in the night and then moving back into Liberia. 2 days after we put out a release was when there was another attack in which 7 UN peacekeepers as well as 10 civilians were killed in a similar attack. But they do remain, relatively isolated incidents. I think the last couple of weeks in Abidjan have certainly brought it up a level. There does appear to be some level of coordination, which of course raises concerns. But I don't think we should overstate it at this stage in terms of the threat in the short term. The real issue, I think, is that the root causes of the conflict unfortunately remain, as the professor has said. The divisive language used by both sides, the manipulation of ethnicity that was the legacy of the FPI party under Gbagbo, unfortunately, the lack of rule of law, a politicized judiciary that's now only holding to account one side. These things still remain, and they need to be addressed quickly if Cote d'Ivoire is going to break out of this cycle that it's been in for the last decade.
Professor, I want to build off something Jean-Gervais was saying. Do you think Ouattara is willing to include Gbagbo supporters in the political process?
Well, one thing earlier signs would say yes, in that he appointed some of the people who served under Gbagbo as ambassadors, in fact, in some cabinet positions, which was the right thing for him to have been doing. And now what the Gbagbo group would say is that it's not enough. Maybe there are not enough of those from the other places in there. Well, that is a little bit complex, because if I'm going to run, for example, a Republican White House, I want to have people in my cabinet that sort of support my ideology and my republicanism, just like we do in the US. So you may not expect Ouattara to en masse bring in Gbagbo supporters to run things for him, because there are still many years of tension that have not yet settled. And we have to be very honest also. As I tell people, I was one of the foremost Gbagbo supporters, believe it or not, because for us, Gbagbo was the Pan-Africanist. He was the man that stood up to Umfu Boigny, fought for democracy, fought for the people. Those was the Gbagbo we remembered. But then again, like many African leaders, once they get power, the power gets into their heads. And one of the things the Gbagbo supporters have to admit is that Gbagbo did do a lot of bad things. That is the first step for them to heal, to accept that he did some wrong things, but he was not the only one that did wrong things. The other parties also did the wrong thing. That is very much clear. But what I found difficult, even when I go to Cote d'Ivoire, I talk to Gbagbo supporters in the diaspora, they have this difficulty of admitting of some of the bad things that Gbagbo did. Until they can admit their own fault, their own wrong, their own guilt, then we're going to be in this same stalemate.
Jean Gervais, we've got about a minute left. Is reconciliation possible?
Yeah, reconciliation is possible. But let me come back to what Mr. Bangura was saying. The question is not appointing people for a certain responsibility. No, that is not the question. The question is, how do we build the country together? How do we solve our the issues between us? When I'm talking to you right now, all the members of the Gbagbo party, the majority are in prison, and others are in exile. And we in Cote d'Ivoire, not far than yesterday or Saturday the 18th, our headquarters...
Jean Gervais, I'm so sorry. I'm going to have to stop you there, but don't go anywhere, because we're going to pick up on that thought in our post-show, which is going to continue in just a few minutes. So keep your comments, your questions coming. Jean Gervais, hold your thought. We do need to get to Malika, though, who's got a couple other story leads that we're following.
Dramendra Abdosh tipped us off to our first lead. Gambian president calls for first executions in 27 years. Have a look.
Next month, all the death sentences would have been carried out to the letter. There is no way my government would allow 99% of the population to be held to ransom by criminals.
In his weekend address, President Yahya Jammeh said those already sentenced to death would be executed. He also said homosexuality, illicit drug use, and subversive activities against the state would not be tolerated. The news sparked criticism online. Benka Mana tweets, "We all know who he is threatening, opponents." Our next leads from Israel, where a biblical theme park offers a modern twist. Kfar Kadem Historical Park in Galilee has equipped donkeys with Wi-Fi. The park shows tourists what life was like 2,000 years ago, teaching them to milk goats, press olives, and ride donkeys. Now those Wi-Fi donkeys will allow visitors to share photos and video of their trip. Our last leads from Syria, where state TV is advertising a new version of Facebook. SyriaBook.net looks and feels familiar, but netizens say it's an attempt by government loyalists to monitor the opposition. Urgent, do not join SyriaBook, NM Syria tweets. It has been identified as a hacking attack page. Eclipsed Expression sums up the hesitation with this tongue-in-cheek tweet. Want to reconnect with your old friends and family members? So do we. Sign up now or we'll force you to. Don't hesitate. Let us know what you think of those stories. Leave us a message at facebook.com/AJStream. Lisa?
All right. Well, stay with us because the post show is next at stream.aljazeera.com. On Thursday, who carries the burden of international sanctions? We're going to explore the impact of sanctions in Iran. And until then, we'll see you online. Hey, you're back in the Stream's post show at stream.aljazeera.com. We're talking about the Ivory Coast and political unrest and violence in the region. And I want to get back to Jean-Gervais Cheide. He's the treasurer of the Ivorian Popular Front. And we were talking about reconciliation when I had to cut you off, Jean-Gervais, so please pick up your thought.
Yeah, I was talking. Hello?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, the question is reconciliation possible in Côte d'Ivoire? I say yes. But the thing is that before reconciliation, both sides have to recognize what they have done. And I am very sorry to watch that Mr. Gbagbo is in The Hague and Mr. Ouattara is in Abidjan. Why is Mr. Gbagbo in The Hague? They say that he is responsible for the killing of some people, right? Because his army has killed Mr. Ouattara. How many people has he killed? And why is he still here? Why is Mr. Soro still here? Either we want reconciliation and we call all the Ivorians together and we discuss of what can be forgiven and what can be punished by the law, and then we go forward. But if one side is supposed to be responsible for the killing or for the crime, and the other side, whereby we know that all the even Human Rights Watch has knowledge that there are thousands of people killed by Mr. Ouattara's group, and he is still here, Mr. Soro is still here, and Mr. Gbagbo is in The Hague. This is mere injustice. This is not possible.
Well, Professor,
so reconciliation is possible if Mr. Gbagbo and his people are sitting at the same table as Mr. Ouattara and his people, and we talk of the court of our country. This is real reconciliation.
Professor Bangura, thank you. Jean-Gervais, I think you raised something that I'd like to bring up with the professor. He asked, why are they still here, meaning Ouattara and Soro? A few of our members on Twitter have an answer. Joyce says, President Ouattara's relationship with France. Some believe this closeness protects him from being charged with crimes against humanity. And another more direct tweet from John Blank, who says, I welcome the conscientious and political uprisings in Ivory Coast. Ouattara is an imperialist stooge placed there for Western profit. A lot of our community members want to talk about France. They want to talk about the international aspect that helped make things as they are now. What's your take on that?
Well, definitely that France sees Côte d'Ivoire as one of its prime lands, so to speak, or its prime new colony, whereas it can get access to resources from Côte d'Ivoire and therefore for his own economic gains. There's no question about that. But the thing about blaming France on one side, it gets a little bit slippery. Because if we know, Gbagbo used to have very good relationship with France. Matter of fact, even the harbor deal that the government spent so much money on was given to, the contract was given to France. One of the leading people for Francophonie used to work in the office as an advisor to Sarkozy. So it's very sometimes hypocritical for the Gbagbo to blame France for everything, as if they themselves did not play two ends in the middle. It just happens that, matter of fact, really, France came to the side of Ouattara in the latter end, because when the forces Nouvelles had the upper hand to really defeat Gbagbo's forces earlier on, France is the one that intervened, that stopped the forces Nouvelles from marching into Abidjan and ending this thing many years ago. So for me, it's a little bit slippery to just one side to blame France, but I think France has a lot of culpability for a lot of things in Côte d'Ivoire. And also what Ouattara did that was very smart. one cannot really link him directly to the Forces Nouvelles or other forces because most of the time he was not even in the country. Now, that doesn't mean he didn't play something behind the door, behind the scenes. We don't know that. So he was very clever enough to distance himself, not to have a very direct link into the rebels that were fighting the government forces. So if you want to really put direct culpability, it will be Soro, who was the leader of the Forces Nouvelles. And it is those Forces Nouvelles that even their push that made Gbagbo to bring Soro into his own regime. So if the Gbagbo forces already benefited from those rebels by allowing him to bring Soro into his own regime, now for you to cry split milk is not going to wash. Right. So at some point they have to use their heads on this issue.
Matt Wells, I want to get a little bit more into the broader human rights issues in the Ivory Coast. There have been some reports of summary executions and rapes happening. Give us a sense of what's really going on the ground there.
You know, I think the concern right now is in response to these security threats, in response to the cross-border attacks and the attacks on military installations in Abidjan. You know, what is the government doing? There's been, you know, credible indication of mass sweeps, you know, rounding up large numbers of youth that are from ethnic groups that tend to be pro-Gbagbo and detaining them. So I think we need to separate, you know, prosecutions of individuals that do have, you know, substantial amount of evidence linking them to grave crimes. And then more broadly, in the more broader sweep-ups in which, you know, we're imposing really collective guilt on a large number of alleged Gbagbo supporters. And the government needs to stop the latter and ensuring that there's individual guilt as opposed to collective suspicion of an entire group of people.
And Matt, what is life like for the average citizen right now on the Ivory Coast? Give us a sense of that.
Well, I mean, you know, again, I think we shouldn't overstate the impact of these attacks. I think, you know, Abidjan, if you compare now to 18 months ago, you know, people have gotten back to their daily lives. Certainly these recent attacks on military installations are a concern, but most people are back to their daily lives. I think, you know, one thing that the professor said at the outset that's so important is that, you know, the average Ivoirian actually is undergoing the process of reconciliation, even if those in power aren't. You know, there's this powerful Ivoirian phenomenon of pardon, you know, to demand or ask forgiveness. And when you talk to, you know, the average woman going to the markets or to the men, you know, at their place of work, groups are back, you know, speaking to another. Reconciliation has started. Where reconciliation hasn't begun is at the highest levels, where the two sides really refuse to accept responsibility for the crimes that they were involved in. And I would ask the FPI treasurer that's with us, you know, does he actually believe that pro-Gbagbo forces were responsible for atrocities during the post-election crisis? And if so, does he not believe that there should be justice for the many victims of these crimes?
Jean Gervais, you want to pick up on that?
Well, atrocities are, everybody says that are on both sides, okay? But the problem is that we must know the beginning of the crisis, of the electoral crisis. Now, this, I already said it. Now, the attacks on the borders, or the military camps, everybody in Côte d'Ivoire knows where they come from. Mr. Ouattara has gathered many soldiers from Mali, Nigeria, or all those people. Those angry forces who have not been integrated in the army, in the national army, are so angry that they are now attacking the camps. Everybody knows that. Everybody knows that in Côte d'Ivoire. And they are manipulating other groups to attack the Mr. Ouattara's regime. And Mr. Ouattara and his forces know all this, but they want to lay the responsibility on the FPI, Mr. Gbagbo's party. This is too easy. Too easy, we know it. But what I can say is that the electoral crisis seems to be over in 2011. But I can tell you, from the April, the day Mr. Gbagbo was overthrown, up to now, if we count the people, the persons who have been killed by Mr. Ouattara's forces, the number can go up to 2,000. I can tell you. In my region, in the west.
Jean Gervais, I'm gonna have to stop you there because I need to give Matt an opportunity to respond. Matt, you've got about 30 seconds.
Well, I mean, I think first, we interviewed the former militiamen and military who crossed into Liberia, who admitted to having taken part in the cross-border attacks and who said openly that they, plan to conduct further attacks. So to lay the blame for those in the West on someone other than pro-Gbagbo fighters doesn't square with the evidence, and including what the fighters themselves say. All right, and
on that note, we are going to have to end this conversation. Our thanks to all of our guests and to our online community for participating in today's show. Excellent discussion. Tomorrow, who carries the burden of international sanctions? We're going to explore the impact of sanctions on Iran, and until then, we'll see you online.